Introducing you to people across North Carolina and around the world who put their Catholic faith into action. This is Faith Works on Catholic 540 AM Divine Mercy Radio. Now, here's your host for Faith Works, Ellen White.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another special edition of Faith Works on Catholic 540 AM Divine Mercy Radio. Our show highlights individuals that, through God's grace, put their faith into action every day. Amazing people who have an interesting and sometimes overlooked impact on our Catholic faith. On Faith Works, we share their stories. I'm your host, Ellen White. Today, I'll be rejoined by Dr. Patrick O'Connell and Father James Garneau, and I'm delighted to welcome a local Catholic business leader, Mr. Bob Letty. And if you're tuning in for the first time, Dr. O'Connell has been practicing medicine in the Raleigh area since 2006, joining Duke Health as a primary care physician, and in 2017 founded Sentinel Primary Care. Dr. O'Connell has a certification in Catholic healthcare ethics from the National Catholic Bioethics Center. Dr. O'Connell is an underwriter for Divine Mercy Radio. Father Garneau is a priest in our diocese and also a member of the board of Divine Mercy Radio. And finally, Mr. Letty is a founder and president of Captive Air Systems and founder and chairman of Franklin Academy, St. Thomas More Academy, and Thales Academy. Thales Academy is an underwriter for Divine Mercy Radio. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time this morning. I really appreciate it. I'll start with current stats and medical issues with Dr. O'Connell. Then we'll turn our attention to Mr. Letty and look at the economic effects of the shutdown as a result of COVID-19, not only here in North Carolina, but throughout our nation. Then I'd like to speak to Father Garneau and have him give us some spiritual guidance on what our perspective should be as Catholic Christians. Dr. O'Connell, let's start with you. What are the current statistics, those affected with the virus or infected with the virus here in North Carolina, and the fatalities from COVID-19?
Yeah, so North Carolina today, the total numbers of people diagnosed is approximately 6,000, and the number of people who have died from the virus is about 150. So the numbers are still growing.
And wasn't this week projected to be the worst nationwide?
That's a good question. I think the projections are sometime around now, late April. Of course, the models keep evolving, so I'm not sure where exactly the anticipated peak is currently.
We've had many discussions in past interviews about the testing methods. Mm-hmm. Where are we now with that?
So we're making good progress on this. You know, historically, meaning 2 weeks ago, the testing method was PCR testing, which would look for the genetic material of the virus itself. Good test, pretty accurate, but turnaround time has been a bit slow. So the big development is antibody testing. So with antibody testing, because the methodology can be much simpler, then there's the potential for test results much faster, like 15 minutes, 20 minutes, instead of 2 to 4 days. So a number of companies have started manufacturing test kits for this. Kind of circuitously, I know of a couple of people who have done testing. So the hope then is we'll have this quick access test that gives good, useful, immediate information. At the moment, the part that's not quite yet there is FDA approval to use these tests in the doctor's office. They are designed in such a way that they're suitable to use in the doctor's office, but they don't yet have the green light from the FDA to start doing that. So at the moment, they're largely restricted to either hospital or commercial laboratory settings or for research purposes, but they're not yet available. So I spent about an hour and a half yesterday reading through lots of FDA information to try to get the latest on it to figure out when can I get these tests, for example. So I think it's coming soon, but not quite yet at your local doctor's office.
And your office, talking about your office and getting information and testing for your office, how is it going there? Have you had any patients that have tested for COVID-19?
Not yet. I've tested a number of people, but have not yet had any turn up positive.
Okay. And tell me, what other ways can this antibody testing be used?
So what I think is going to be one of the more valuable pieces of it is not so much the clinical application at the bedside, but rather getting a better handle on what's happening from a population standpoint. As I've said from the very beginning, I think lots of people are getting infected with coronavirus. It's going unrecognized. And unrecognized not because somebody dropped the ball, but because they have very mild illness. Most cases of coronavirus infection are either mild or completely asymptomatic. Therefore, one, we have a skewed perspective of the severity of the virus, but then the second is we don't have a handle on what's happening broadly in the community with virus transmission. If you only are identifying the sickest people and the asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic people are going unrecognized, then you have a very skewed perception of the virus's activity in the community. So what the antibody test offers the chance to do is begin to get that community-wide view of things. And that then ties into things like, well, when will government officials decide to start relaxing some of the restrictions that have been put in place? Second is it gets to a more meaningful understanding of how bad is the virus, because if we have a better sense of what the true denominator is of how many people have gotten sick with it, and then we know how many people have died from it, then it gives a better clinical assessment. And then the third is it also helps with this, getting a handle on this idea of herd immunity, which is originally a veterinary term, but applies very well to human populations as well. The idea is if you have a herd of animals and some percentage of those animals are immune to a given infection, then even those members of that herd that are susceptible to the infection, they're vulnerable, well, they're not going to get the infection because there's no other animals to give it to them. And so when that threshold is reached, the entire herd becomes immune. And so that's a concept that's been talked about with coronavirus. You got to get to a pretty high percentage to get to that level of herd immunity. But if we have no idea what percentage of people have been infected, we have no idea where we are in relation to that. So the antibody test offers that sort of understanding of a population-wide study with implications then for civil authority decision-making and understanding the risk of the population as a whole.
What's going on with that in North Carolina? Are there any studies that are being done to promote the antibodies test? What are we doing here in the state, or is it nationwide, people?
So I don't know about nationwide, but I know locally in North Carolina, so Wake Forest University, Bowman Gray School of Medicine started earlier this week a population study using research-based home antibody tests that they, and I think it's to 1,000 people, to try to get a representative sampling of the population, and then folks would receive their tests, enter their data online, and then the researchers can look at this sample population and say, what can we therefore say about the population as a whole? And that's potentially research that happens pretty quickly. Just somebody receives the test kit, they do the test, they enter their data, and researchers have a large sample size pretty fast. So I'm very excited. I'm very interested to see what comes out of that study from Bowman Gray. You mentioned asymptomatic folks. Let's talk about that a little bit. Mm-hmm. I think that might be one of the scariest issues that people are thinking about when going back out. If you're carrying something, and it's almost like you're afraid to go back out because you might be carrying something, but at the same time, if we've been in quarantine for so long, wouldn't we know if we had it? And there's so many different questions that are going around in my head with that. Yep. So, the issue of asymptomatic infection and asymptomatic transmission, it's both reassuring and incredibly distressing at the same time. So the reassuring part is to say, if you get coronavirus, what has been sort of presented in the headlines is, good God, you'll be lucky to live through it. And that's just not the case. It is a potentially dangerous and potentially fatal virus, but many people who get infected with it remain asymptomatic. And one of the first shows that we did when we talked about this, we had the experience of one of the cruise ships where they had tested everyone on the cruise ship, and I think 20% of the people tested positive, and 50% of those people had no symptoms. And then yesterday, we got very similar data. The aircraft carrier, the Theodore Roosevelt, similar thing. They tested almost everyone on the ship. That portion of people who tested positive, 60% of them were asymptomatic. Now, that's a little different population. It's a younger, healthier group of people. You could then say, well, how many of them were going to become symptomatic in the next couple of days, which is a legitimate question. But a substantial portion of people who are infected with coronavirus do not become sick. That's the reassuring part. The distressing part is that when you are asymptomatically infected, you can spread the virus. And there are documented cases of that occurring, which means you walk out your front door and everyone who looks healthy walking past you in the aisle of the grocery store, they are your enemy. They may spread coronavirus to you, or you may spread it to them. And so that creates a bit of a, I don't want to say paranoia, but a distressing sense of uncertainty in terms of you giving it to others or others giving it to you. That's part of where folks have talked about maybe being able to use antibody testing to say, this person already has antibodies. They've already been through asymptomatic infection, so therefore they're safe from others and they're safe to others. So yeah, asymptomatic infection and the risk of spread is an issue with both an upside and a downside to it.
So I know that there wasn't clear information about this before. Where are we now with whether or not we can become reinfected with the virus?
So we don't know for sure. This is still in the realm of sketchy data and anecdotes. Based on what we know about the virus, I think this is not the CDC or whatever. I think probably you get infected, you clear the virus, and you're done. That's the way it is with most viruses. And viruses where, for example, antibodies are unsuccessful in neutralizing the virus, those often become chronic infections. And there's example there of hepatitis C, for example, which is a chronic viral liver infection. So I think that coronavirus probably is a once and done infection. There are some curious anecdotes. One, a small group of patients in South Korea who tested positive for the PCR. So again, testing the genetic material of the virus, but there was not a lot of clinical information about had they gotten sick again or had they failed to get healthy to begin with. So it remains a bit of an uncertain topic. I think one of the things that points towards, if you produce antibodies, then you get rid of the virus, that being the physiology of it, is there's been interesting, promising initial studies using antibodies from a person who's already gotten sick and recovered and using those antibodies to transfuse them to someone who is currently sick. And the initial research suggests that it may shorten the infection, which would suggest then that the antibodies really are functional and meaningful in controlling the virus. So it's still a bit of a murky topic, but I think probably it will turn out that this is a once and done infection.
Okay. I have a dear friend that has 2 college-age daughters that have cystic fibrosis. And obviously, this is a very serious issue for them. One of them had written something about how she was disheartened with people's lack of response to the request for, social distancing, and just in light of she and her sister's experience with cystic fibrosis and what they're going through. What would you say to somebody, a mother of children like this, that's saying she feels like it's imprudent to encourage us to go out again in light of her current situation?
Improve for her daughters to go out, you mean, or for?
Well, just in general, to do this too soon with the
Right.
push of opening up the economy. As a medical professional, what would you say?
Yeah, so I think this is the Scylla and Charybdis of this virus and how we respond to it. On the one hand, 150 North Carolinians have died from this virus, and more will die. And nationally, 30-some thousand have died at this point. On the other hand, the isolation and stay at home and shutting things down has its own price that goes with it. It's Odysseus sailing home, encountering Scylla and Charybdis, had to decide the whirlpool or the monster. And so both of these are unattractive in their own right. It is a judgment of prudence of, is the virus the greater danger, or is our response and the unintended consequences of the response the greater danger? Mm-hmm. Experiences vary. New York City has one experience where the medical harms from the virus have been quite substantial. My own experience, I have yet to diagnose someone, but I've had a number of people dealing with very serious issues as consequences of isolating and shutting down, people in fear of infection, avoiding needed hospitalization in one case, another person unfortunately relapsing into alcoholism, a number of people struggling very seriously with serious anxiety. So there is no easy path on this. Our efforts to not get infected with coronavirus don't come cheaply, though. That's for certain.
Right. And I read, I subscribe to Catholic Vote, and Brian Birch, the president from Catholic Vote, wrote recently, you can't put an entire economy in the freezer, and citizens cannot be locked inside their homes in perpetuity. Doing so will only lead to widespread poverty, depression, and suicide. So yeah, the unintended consequences, it makes it a very difficult decision to make for my friend and her girls, and also for those that are losing their jobs and moving forward.